Lisa Selin Davis, you are the author of two novels and you write for publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, and many others. And you just wrote a book called Tomboy, The Surprising History and Future of Girls Who Dare to Be Different. Lisa, thank you for being here.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So I think this is a fascinating subject, Tomboy, and the outlook of girls, how we treat girls, how we treat boys, and repercussion that that has when they grow up. They grow up with this mentality. I'm supposed to always look pretty, and the boy is always supposed to be looking macho and assertive and be in a role of leadership. And I think we cement that from the time that they are little kids. And this is something that I would like to talk about. But before we get there, I would like to know a little bit more about you. Who are you? How do you get into writing? Why these subjects are of interest to you?
Well, I always wanted to be a writer since I was about 8. And I was not, I think a lot of people get into writing because they got a good grade on a paper at some point and then spend the rest of their lives chasing that grade. So I don't think I'm any different. I got an A plus on a paper in 10th grade and was like, oh, I like this. I'm good at this. But I was actually pretty discouraged from it. I tried to study writing in college, and my advisor said, a kind of grand lady sat me down and said, you are not a writer. So I did not pursue it for a long time. After college, I worked in the film industry, and I worked in the art department of the film industry and did a lot of graphics and some set dressing and things like that. But I always wanted to write, and I was looking for a way out of that career, and I kept studying other things. I studied environmental psychology, and then I studied urban planning. So I went to 2 different graduate schools. And then my older brother said, I don't understand why you're going to urban planning school if you want to be a writer and not an urban planner. So I decided that I would study writing, and eventually thought I would try to be an urban planning journalist, which I kind of was for a while. And then that segued into writing about real estate because I could get paid to do that. So my career was really bound by trying to pay my rent. I was not that fussy about what kind of gigs I took because everything is practice, and I didn't have a trust fund.
And
So I just was like, yeah, are you paying me? I'll write it. And
okay, but you already have taken, you already had a degree, you already had a master. How else do you pursue the learning of writing? Do you take like evening classes or community college classes? What was the vehicle to learn about writing?
well, I did eventually get an MFA in fiction writing, and I did leave my program with an agent and sold my first novel. So in theory, that worked out for me, except that it worked out in that I got enough money to live for about 6 months. It didn't do much long term. That novel didn't propel me to anything. But I after I got my degree, I started freelancing for magazines and newspapers. And in the beginning, I was working for like $40 an article, anything, just to get practice, just to get bylines. I really started at the bottom and worked my way up. And so the way that I wrote for those bigger publications was sometimes by meeting people and networking, which is one advantage of living in New York City. Um, but sometimes I would, when I wanted to pitch a section of the New York Times, I actually just called up the main number and said, who is the editor at the House and Home section, which no longer exists, and then called that section and said, could someone give me the email? So I was scrappy about it. I was working hard to try to get into better and better publications. And here I am. I think I've written 600 or 700 articles. I've written 3 books, and I think my rejection rate is probably still 80%. I mean, I'm still banging on the door most of the time begging, look, could you please let me write for you? I have like a couple places now that employ me regularly, but I'm still banging on the door.
How about publications like the Wall Street Journal, which is stocks and economy, and I mean, from your education, that doesn't seem to be like your area of expertise. How do you get the the Wall Street Journal to take your articles?
Well, I wrote for the real estate section.
Mm.
I wrote a lot of things for the real estate section, and I had a great editor there. And she found me. I had put my information on. There are various websites you can put yourself on as a freelancer, and someone can go looking for, oh, who writes about real estate? And then, so that was very unusual in that they reached out to me. And I haven't written for them for the last maybe year and a half or something since I, dedicated myself to writing the book. I couldn't freelance as much. But it, I because I had been kind of obsessed with real estate and because I had studied urban planning, I developed a kind of expertise, in that area, enough to write about it. So
Okay, so then now you are busy writing for these publications and banging on doors. How
yeah.
do you juggle that with writing? You have written two novels already. I mean, you need to kind of separate your mind and your space and everything else. Like this is my time for hustling and this is my time for myself.
Well, I think if you are not wealthy and you want to be a writer, then the most important thing is cheap rent. And I moved to Brooklyn a long time ago, 27 years ago. So my rent is a lot cheaper than anybody who moves here now. And that's why my neighborhood is like filled with corporate lawyers now and not so many writers. So cheap rent is the first part. Cheap rent is so important for any kind of entrepreneurial creativity, and it's something we should protect at all costs everywhere. Is cheap rent. So there's a price to pay for it in other ways in certain kinds of. I mean, I live in a crazy rent stabilized building, but it has its charm. And yeah, it's about multitasking. It's about being able to do many, many things at once, be pitching, be working on an article, be conceiving of a bigger book. I think that for a long time, I saw the way my brain worked as a flawed and of not being able to commit to anything or concentrate on anything. I've had to, in the beginning of doing interviews, the publicist had to say to me, like, don't try to say 5 things at once. Try to speak in shorter sentences. Don't give super long answers. And that's because I'm always thinking of 4 or 5 different things at the same time. So when I speak, it comes out as a big mush, but it works well for a writing career in which you've got to juggle all the time.
Right. But I mean the mental space. I mean, let's say you are focusing on an article for the New York Times. So you are doing all your research, you have all your tabs open in your computer, and you are submerged into this world. And then let's say it turns 4 o'clock, and then you say, okay, now I gotta take this out of my screen, and now it's my time to write my next whatever, Tomboys, let's say. So is that how you do it, or do you dedicate one day for this and one day for the other one? And just want to know, how do you organize things on your mind in order to work on two different writing projects at the same time?
I'm not that organized. I don't have a schedule. And, my kids are doing school at home and everything is insane. And what I do, I make a list of what I'm working on, but I often make that list in 4 or 5 different places. It's slightly different everywhere. No, it's chaos in my brain. So that's what I'm saying. I think it's not, just recently I've begun to think maybe there's a way I can use that chaos. And it's chaos not just with work, it's chaos with my thoughts, and it's hard to manage what's going on in there. But what I do is I open up my computer and I have 4 or 5 different documents open. So I'm working on a book proposal right now that's kind of about the history of working moms. And I nibble away at that. And in order to do that, I need to dump everything into one big giant document. And then I'll start separating it out into pieces. And I'm reading things on the internet, and I'm reading actual books, and I'm typing little notes in. And then I'm also working on an op-ed that's kind of about the idea of the supermom and how we could really use a superhero right now who is actually a mother, but very, very rarely do we ever see superheroes who are mothers, because of course, how could they possibly do that? So I'm working on that. And then I'm working on a much longer feature article. So I'm nibbling away at all these things. Some of them are assignments that someone's waiting for, and some of them are things that I want to pitch. Right. So I've always wanted the New York Times to like come after me and say, you should be on our staff, or we'll give you a contract. But that's never how they've never offered me anything. It's always me writing and submitting and waiting and hoping.
Wow. Okay, so now let's get to your book, Tomboy. How that idea came to mind? What was going on in your life that said, okay, this is what I want to write about?
Well, actually, I tried for a while not to write about it. So, I write a lot of personal essays and reported personal essays, and I've been doing this for a long time. So when I had kids, I started writing more essays about my experience as a mom and about my children, without considering the long-term implications of that, I should say. Like, I didn't think, oh, my kids are going to read this someday. Never occurred to me. So when my daughter was about 3, and that's when kids are starting to segregate by sex, right? A lot of times, young kids in small groups, they play together, but often when they get to preschool, they start dividing into boys and girls more. And my kid was staying in the middle, and she was different from everybody else there in that she was willing to play any game, but she would play princess with the girls, but she didn't want to be a princess. She wanted to be the dog or the royal police officer. And she was friends with boys and girls, but a little bit more with the boys. And then when she was old enough to have a say in what she wanted to wear, she wasn't really into dresses, and she wanted short hair. So she was veering toward what I thought of at the time as like boy stuff, boy haircuts, boy clothes, without asking myself, where does the idea of boy haircuts and boy clothes and boy toys, where are those ideas from? Because I was raised in the 1970s when a lot of that was de-emphasized, and many girls were encouraged to play with stuff that was quote unquote boy stuff. So as I was watching my kid, I was wondering about her, but I wasn't really asking about the culture and how the culture had changed. And then when she was in first grade, she came home and said, someone at school told me I'm a tomboy. And that's when I realized, oh, that word was so common in my youth. There were so many short-haired girls in boys' clothes in my youth. And I hadn't heard the word in a long time. And I also hadn't seen very many girls like that since I'd become a parent. And I wrote a piece that I submitted to the New York Times, and they took, right? There's no mystery. I got an email address. I wrote this piece. I sent it to them, and I hoped, and they took it. They didn't know me at all. And the piece was about all the people in my life assuming my kid was trans because she liked boy stuff, and that I wanted to really be supportive of trans kids, but I also didn't want to be rejecting gender stereotypes with gender identity. And what I didn't know at all, I thought I had written a nice, supportive, interesting, complex piece. I did not know that there was a whole culture war going on between trans people and feminists. Not all of them, of course, but like a loud culture war and on social media and somewhat in the law, especially in England, where people are fighting about definitions of words and claiming territory. And so there was a big eruption on social media, and it was my first experience with cancel culture. So I wanted to stay away from this topic after that. But at the same time, as a journalist and as a person interested in psychology generally, um, and a person who did not feel comfortable being labeled a transphobe, I decided to reach out to some of the people who had criticized me and to some other prominent trans people and gender therapists and say, okay, you don't like what I wrote. Tell me more about that. And so that was just part of what happened. And the other part was the interest in like the disappearance of the tomboy as I knew her from my childhood.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this cancel culture? I hear there's a lot of things going on with J.K. Rowling saying that a woman is someone who menstruates and she has gotten a lot of fight against that. And so I know there is all this noise going around. Me, since that's not my world, I don't have kids right now. I just hear from the outside, but now I'm curious, what is exactly going on in this culture?
Well, I think it's about these categories of man and woman and whether they are social categories, that is like that don't have to do with your body, that anyone can be a man and anyone can be a woman based on how they identify, versus a biological category, which is based on your body. But it's also about how people treat you. So one of the things I think she's saying is that one of the things that makes me a woman is that like I've spent my life being treated like one. And um, the research shows that we treat boys and girls very, very differently. I think parents think that because we might offer them the same things, that actually, you know, childhood is fairly equitable now, but that's not what the research shows. It's people use different tones of voice, they react differently to dangerous situations, they have different facial expressions. Everything, no matter how subtle it is, about the way they treat boys and girls is different. And that means ultimately we're socialized differently. And as men and women, or males and females, which would be the biological category. So, you know, who gets to opt into what category, who gets to opt out, who gets to define the boundaries? These are the questions being asked. And I think J.K. Rowling is answering how she's answering, and it's very, very threatening to many people who feel that if you are like one of the richest women in the world, you know, that you should be sensitive to the fact that many people don't agree, and that many trans people are, you know, their daily lives are more difficult and they're more vulnerable, and feel that her words have made them more vulnerable. But I think that we haven't figured out a safe, careful, effective, kind, useful way to ask these questions about these boundaries, these categories, these groups. Because I have questions too, but I generally don't feel comfortable asking them.
Well, from my perspective, I think that we as a society, we are teaching girls to be people pleaser and to focus always on looking pretty, on having the long hair. And I don't know, girls at the age of 4 or 5 start already playing with makeup and lipstick and still in their mother's high heels or whatever. So it's all this emphasis of how to look pretty, how to please people, how to be polite, how to be inclusive, while the boys are being taught how to be more assertive, more aggressive, how to, I don't know, build engineers' mind. And we see this in our entrepreneurial world where all the idols are men. We have, I don't know, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, in the finance world, Warren Buffett. And I think we had to figure out ways in which we can teach girls to be more leaders as opposed to be the companion of a leader.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're onto something there. And I think what most people, not all, but most people who've studied the way we've gendered childhood come to feel, especially the way we've limited boys, right? We're focusing on girls, but the gendered messages for boys are very constraining. They're very much like, don't have a full range of emotions, don't be kind, don't be interested in anything that's marked as feminine, and basically don't express your full humanity. And these discussions about toxic masculinity are really rooted in the way we raise boys. So ultimately, I think the conclusion many people who study the gendering of childhood come to is that we have to raise girls more like boys and boys more like girls. We just shouldn't be emphasizing the differences between them so much, and let them explore, because they don't feel safe accessing both sides of the pink-blue divide. So my argument is, let's mix up the pink and blue into something magenta, just so kids can explore and develop into their full human selves.
And do you think there's already a mixing up of this pink and blue? Because, for example, I see now movies and many of the action figures nowadays are female. It's no longer the female who is the companion of the hero. Have, I don't know, Tomb Raiders. I forgot what, I don't know these movie characters, but I know a Wonder Woman, for example. There is now Captain something.
Captain Marvel,
And
yeah.
and then on the other side, from time to time, I watch something called K-pop, which is Korean pop. And now you have all these kids who are not gay, but they are all wearing makeup and they're all wearing hair with, I don't know, pink or orange or whatever. They have all these feminine traits.
Mm.
So now my question is, in the new culture, is there more of a mix?
Well, I think from what little I know about gender and sexuality in some Asian cultures, of course, that's a huge category. And you're just talking about K-pop, but fascinatingly, the word tomboy in, I think also in Korea, in the Philippines, in Thailand, a few other Southeast Asian countries, um, means a kind of butch lesbian and sometimes a trans man, and it has nothing to do with children. And I think there are many cultures that have different relationships to gender and sexuality than American culture, which is, the dominant culture is homophobic and transphobic. I mean, I hate to throw those words around, but I think it's pretty accurate. But there are all kinds of subcultures um, gaining more prominence. And what you're talking about is the normalizing of certain behaviors or looks that once upon a time were seen as feminine and thus off limits to men, now becoming accessible to men. And what that shows us is that a lot of what we think of as acceptable for men or women, what we think of as masculine or feminine, is changeable if we change the culture. And so, yes, I mean, I don't want to make too big a deal about now you can have pink and orange hair, but I think it's part of that shift of having different rules for what boys can do and what girls can do. Most of it is arbitrary, and most of it is to try to socially control people based on their sex. So I think we've had many examples of the culture shifting so that our ideas of masculine and feminine shift. But I think the rules used to be very overt, where you could get a book that said, here's how a girl should behave and here's how a boy should behave. And now we've had, on paper, it looks like we have all this equality. But every time we make gains in equality, the rules get quieter, subtler, harder to identify. And then people don't realize that those rules are actually still the kind of skeleton that we're building our culture around. So they have to be aware of it first.
But also, isn't there that we are putting the post a little bit farther away? Because at one time, women were not allowed to wear pants.
Yeah,
Now no
right.
one
Not that
now
long ago. right?
Yeah, so now no one thinks twice about that. So I think in a way there is some kind of progress. It said that we want to reach even more progress. We want a higher level of equality, but I think equality is being achieved slowly, but it's being achieved.
It's been achieved slowly, and then the pushback gets more insidious. So we can wear pants. And we can wear pants only because women fought so hard in the dress reform movement to say we shouldn't have to wear these corsets and these bustles and these petticoats that are bad for our health and restrict our free movement, right? So wearing pants was something that women had to fight really hard for. And I think a lot of people look and say, hey, you can wear pants. So there you go, you've achieved equality. And yet, women still make 80 cents on the dollar. There's no universal child care, but 64% of women in America are either the breadwinners or the co-breadwinners of their families, but still expected to do the bulk of the child care. So it's like, okay, we have the pants,
Yes.
but now we need the public policy to go with the pants.
Okay. And talking about public policy, you are in the United States, but in many other countries, this public policy is already there, especially in the northern countries. In New Zealand, we have a prime minister in New Zealand who is a true leader, and people admire her for her
Yeah.
leadership.
Yeah.
We have Iceland. I think we have the youngest prime minister, female prime minister in history. I think she's only in her 30s, and people admire her. So. So maybe you are referring mostly to the United States, and of course, if we look at other places like Africa and Saudi Arabia, they are so far back that it's just even ridiculous that only until last year women were allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, I believe,
Yeah.
without a companion or something of
Yeah.
that nature. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
so I guess the spectrum from one country to the other one is just huge.
Yes, it's huge. And I think it's really important for all the people battling about categories to remember that, you know, the freedoms that we've achieved in America only came from activism and are so recent, and all over the world women don't have those. They cannot wear pants. They cannot make decisions about who they marry or how many children they'll have, about what jobs they have. And but what's kind of fascinating about America, as opposed to, the Scandinavian countries that have the most gender equality and that have the most social programming, right? They also have paid family leave and universal health care and all kinds of advanced civilized things that promote gender equality. But what's fascinating about America is just the way every time we pass a law, that helps us work toward equality, the culture kind of pushes back to continue to try to make us behave. So, for instance, in the 70s, I think 72, Title IX was passed that said girls need to have their equal education to boys. And it was mostly focused on sports because there were all these boys' sports and very few girls' sports. So in theory, girls should be, able to play baseball like boys. But there's a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of girls who play baseball, tiny, and it barely ever lasts after puberty anyway. And in fact, many fewer girls play sports as they get older. So we have the law in place, but because, as you say, girls are reared to focus on their appearance more than anything else, and boys are reared to focus on their independence and strength. And of course, not all of them, right? But this is what the research shows, is that generally these are the messages. The law is only part of it. The policy is only part of it. Changing the culture requires so much more. It requires our participation in changing it, and it requires our awareness and our commitment to changing it. Or it just requires cultural movements like, K-pop. I mean, it
Yeah.
requires normalizing things that seem weird at first.
Well, just one last example to that came to my mind is last year the women's soccer team had huge rating, huge amount of. They won this amazing. I don't know how far they got. I don't remember. But in spite of all the successes and in spite of having higher TV ratings than the men's soccer team, their pay was only half of the
Yeah,
men's soccer team, and they couldn't win that.
they lost that case.
It's just
Can't
amazing.
remember why they lost. Yeah. I mean, we just value women less, even though it would be impossible to have a society without them, not only because of procreation, but just because of the amount that they support the economy, but with paid and unpaid labor. So how do we get to the point where we see this work as equally valuable? That's the question. I think we've seen the result of hypergendering childhood. We've seen the result of dividing every aspect of their lives into pink and blue, masculine and feminine, all their toys, all their personality traits, all their clothes. We've seen what happens. I would like to do this experiment where we just de-emphasize it, where we don't make sex the major focus of their lives when they're young, and then see what happens. And I think, going back to Scandinavia, the gender neutral preschools in Sweden, which, that term can be difficult for people. Gender neutral, they don't know what it means. And really all they're saying is we're just not focusing on sex that much, on the sex of your body, and everything is for everyone, and we're kind of insulating you from gender stereotypes. And so far, those kids have grown up to be like less hampered by the gender stereotypes that affect most people who are exposed to them. And there's also really great research that shows how easy it is to counteract stereotypes. That they do these experiments where they take kids into a room, and some of them they show images of like a girl playing with a toy car, and some of them they show a boy with it, and they mix it up, and then they ask the kid, is this a girl toy or a boy toy? And the kids who have seen pictures of girls playing with that car will say, oh, that's a girl's toy. So, but you can't just tell your kid that, because your kid is getting the information from the entire culture. Right. So you can do a certain amount in your family or in a small science experiment in a lab, but until we alert people to why they need to change this, and then ask them to participate, and ask the manufacturers and toy makers and clothing manufacturers to participate, we can't make the change. But I would love to see it. I'd just love to see what happens if we make gender equity part of childhood.
Okay, Lisa, I was supposed to talk to you about your book Tomboy, and I feel like I drove you to all kind of different directions. So I just wanted to, I wonder if there is anything that you would like to add in regards to your book Tomboy.
Yes, what I would like to say is that often when people hear me talking on a podcast, or they read, there was with me in the New York Times yesterday, and it was very condensed, and I'm getting these letters saying, you make it sound so simplistic. And of course, it's a tiny little condensed interview, and we're talking about a tiny portion of this. But if you're skeptical, if you're listening to this and you're skeptical, then I would just ask you to read the book, because the book has a rich bibliography. There's a lot of research in it. And the point of the book is not necessarily to give you the answers. The point of the book is to get you to ask questions about where your idea of what's normal for boys and girls came from, and to ask yourself, if you want to keep participating in that. So if you're feeling skeptical about it, instead of rejecting it, I would ask you to do what I did when I first started this project and move forward toward it and give it a chance, read it and see if you learn anything, because this was the greatest intellectual experience of my life, learning about this. And I, of course, thought I knew a lot about gender, and I actually knew almost nothing.
Wow. Okay, Lisa, well, can you tell us one more time the name of your book and where can people follow you?
The name of the book is Tomboy: The Surprising History and Future of Girls Who Dare to Be Different. And I'm on all the Twitter, Instagram, etc. at Lisa Selin Davis. And buy the book from your local bookstore.
Yes, yes, please.
Please.
Okay, Lisa, well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and I appreciate it.